Okay. All right. Hello and a very warm welcome to this afternoon session on ensuring investments into climate mitigation and the macroeconomic implications. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the former director of Bruegel, and I'm now the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm really pleased to host you today, Sigrid Kaag. You are the Minister of Finance and first Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and it's really a pleasure and honor to host you today and to discuss this very important topic that is really very, very critical for the future of, well, I would say our planet, and certainly the future of the European Green Deal with you. We have a speech by the minister, and after the speech, we do have some time to engage in a conversation here on the stage, and of course with you, the audience. So please do send us questions on Slido if you are following us online. Or do stand up and ask a question here physically in the room by just raising your hand, and I can give you the floor and give you the mic. Without much further ado, thank you so much, Minister, for joining us today, and we look forward to your speech.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here. I'll just walk over there. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. And I think if we consider our room to be fairly warm, if we consider Spitsbergen, the temperature is rising faster than anywhere else, by 6 degrees over the past 60 years. In Europe, never before have so many hectares of forest burnt down as in the past 6 months of this year. Our rivers, drought and low water levels are causing problems for inland shipping, raising prices even further. This is not news. And these are only a few recent items about climate change. And these days, an internet search on the subject can make you want to slam your laptop down, close your eyes, pretend you didn't read it, or pretend it didn't happen. Fortunately, we are also seeing deepening and broadening awareness of the fact that closing our eyes, as we have done, will only lead us towards catastrophe. Insofar, we have not already reached that point. And so I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak today about one of the most important and more complex issues of our time, climate change, and the task before us. Specifically, how to ensure public and private investment in climate mitigation and, of course, adaptation. Because we will accomplish very little if we do not invest and spend our money in the right way and in a timely manner. And as I was preparing this lecture, my thoughts turned to the namesake of the Institute, Peter Bruegel, and his most famous painting, The Tower of Babel. It's a picture you can look at for hours, a picture that evokes danger and darkness. And every time you look, you may notice something else. It's based on a biblical story that is equally fascinating because of its multifaceted symbolism. And looking at this painting today, reflecting on it, I see parallels with climate change. Have we humans been too arrogant, building, consuming, and spending, on, to the extent that we have exhausted nature and planet? Have we put technology before nature? Is Earth now confining our plans like God in the Tower of Babel story? After all, it is a story. There's no question that we must do something about climate change. And fortunately, the sense of urgency and the willingness to take action are growing everywhere. In this regard, I believe we need to consider two questions. First, are we doing enough? And are we still in time? Secondly, how do we get everyone and keep everyone on board? The beginning of my answer to the first question is this. We have the goals. We are expressing a sufficient level of ambition, but we need to follow through with determined action. We are talking the talk, and we now need to walk the walk. The battle against climate change puts demands on all of us, consumers, policymakers, companies, and financial institutions. It's important we join forces in this battle because national borders are pretty irrelevant when it comes to climate and its consequences. The way to do is through a common European policy and climate action by financial institutions, companies, individuals, organizations. So first of all, we have to walk the walk at home. To that end, the Dutch government has defined ambitious goals. We're aiming for a 60% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, 80% by 2040, and climate neutrality by 2050. And we're supported in this effort by the European Commission, whose Fit for 55 package sets all the right priorities. It's now up to the Council and Parliament, European Parliament, to reach agreement on this package. And I urge everyone to stand fast in their ambitions. And it's also upon all of us, member states, to start working towards these goals. It's in our direct interest to do so from a human perspective, a humanitarian consideration, and of course, a very strong economic point of view. As the remorseless droughts and forest fires this summer have shown, there is no turning back. Healthy public finances make sustainable reforms possible, reforms that are the foundation of a climate strategy that is also fit for the future. And European funding should also pursue sustainable objectives. Member states can use funding from the Recovery and Resilience Facility to strengthen their economies for the future. 37% of the funds from this facility has to be spent on green measures, and at least 30% of funding from the multi-annual financial framework and the Recovery Fund together must contribute towards these climate goals. In this way, we are following up in a tangible manner on the aims we've set ourselves. And I'm proud, well, humbly proud to say that with 48% of our financing envelope going towards green measures, we far exceed these minimal threshold. And I say humbly proud because we are, of course, it is known, we were pretty late in our own submission. So I think some modesty is applicable here. But of course, EU funds alone are not enough. The member states need to show and demonstrate their national responsibility is fit for purpose to free up sufficient funding alongside the right policy choices for climate policy. We have established in the Netherlands a 35 billion euro climate fund for the next 10 years to help us achieve a sustainable transition, even when the going gets tough. And the private sector has a determined role to play here. In fact, the bulk of investment will have to come from the private sector, as Bruegel has calculated. By now, there are a few companies that do not have sustainability high on their agenda. But there too, we need to not only have it on the agenda, we need to show determined actions by companies. They need to report on it, and they need to be transparent about it. Because it's essential that the private sector too matches words with deeds. And I have therefore called on the financial sector to draw up ambitious goals, like the government, and to take responsibility. After all, many of them determine how and where money flows. And so they can achieve a huge impact by not financing big polluters or by encouraging industries to become more sustainable. At the same time, I'm asking, on behalf of the Cabinet, financial institutions to be transparent about what they do, when they do it, why they do it, and report on it. So market discipline can do its work. Because consumers, clients, and civil society organizations increasingly set store by their bank, insurer, or pension fund to be sustainable. This is not only responsible business conduct, it's important for the stability of the financial sector itself. Financial institutions must deal effectively with those risks of climate change, which will also affect them in due course. It's an ultimate message. We will only succeed if we work, plan, and invest together. So I want to share experiences with other pioneers in Europe on making the financial sector more sustainable and continuing to make progress with this agenda across the European Union. The connection between the real economy and the financial sector, between Fit for 55 and the sustainable finance agenda is key. We have the plans and the ambitions. The time ahead will be about implementation. And this brings me to my second question. How do we get everyone on board and keep them on board? It's not an easy question, so I also look forward to hearing views from the audience and of course the director, the former director of the German Institute, and his views on this. But studies have shown that a growing number of Europeans recognize that action is necessary or vital. But the reality is that we're living in a time of political and economic instability, to put it mildly. Putin's brazen invasion of Ukraine this year and the ongoing war has put paid to many of our uncertainties. And this war is still raging, with many heartbreaking consequences. A devastated country, many thousands dead or injured, and millions of refugees. The war has also increased economic uncertainty worldwide, including in Europe, and of course, speaking for my country, the Netherlands. It's led to skyrocketing inflation, soaring energy prices, which are now so high that even middle-class families are finding it harder to make ends meet, to say nothing of people who were already struggling on the lowest incomes or social minima. The impact of high energy prices is especially devastating on those low-income households. And of course, we need to help, we need to assist, and we need to be there. We can do so with targeted support measures for vulnerable groups. But we also need to ensure a well-functioning energy market. And this includes setting ambitious efforts to reduce energy demand. And I would like to add here a word of caution about measures that may form a subsidy on energy consumption. It's perhaps not caution, but the urge to reflect. Because as shown in the paper on this very important topic today, published by Bruegel, measures can also unduly undo the incentive to reduce in a strategic manner energy demand, to redirect it. So we need to think about all possible measures in a smart way that it helps to meet the goal without producing unintended consequences. And I believe EU measures to cushion the blow of high energy prices should not, of course, be taken at the expense of the energy transition. It requires a careful balancing act to manage short-term needs, which are urgent, versus the longer-term goals of the energy transition. And these are, of course, the questions, the big political issues that all of us try to grapple with today and the coming weeks. And despite the uncertain situations we currently find ourselves in, when it comes to climate action, we don't have the luxury to press the pause button, because doing nothing would also have far-reaching economic, humanitarian, and political repercussions. Politicians and administrators have to act now, but also continue to have regard for the long term. And in the longer term, it's in everyone's interest we set our shoulder to the wheel now. By making choices, we can actually prepare for the future without losing sight of the urgent, pressing needs of today and tomorrow. And this does not relieve us of the responsibility to strive for a transition in which we truly leave no one behind. A transition that takes account of those for whom the burden has already become too heavy. Change is ultimately very difficult, and all the more when it seems to demand a sacrifice. Take, for instance, the Dutch agricultural sectors, our farmers, who've been asked to reduce their nitrogen emissions. They are understandably concerned about their future, the future of their farms, their livelihoods, which in many cases has been in the family for decades or sometimes hundreds of years. And their reaction is to express their discontent, their protest against some of the plans or all of the plans. A small group has also taken this to extremes, which goes beyond the acceptable. But their concerns, their questions and their fears are the heart of the matter, and these are understandable. They ask for solutions in a manner that is appropriate and takes into concern the wider perspective. So we need to understand that. Besides having an impact at scale, all these good, vital initiatives and intentions that I talked about earlier also have consequences for individuals and their lives. The challenge for us, politicians and administrators, is not to lose sight of this fact and to continue to translate policy jargon into real-world examples. A percentage in the Stability and Growth Pact or a provision in the taxonomy regulation. How does this translate into the lives of citizens, to a low-income household that needs to insulate their home, or a business owner whose income model is at risk? It may sound nice on paper, but we need to be able to think this through and understand how it will be perceived or received. If we do not make this translation, we'll get a Babylonian confusion of tongues like in the biblical story. Two worlds that no longer understand each other, and yet the task before us is to act together and to really work from a societal perspective. In this, we need to also be mindful of false distinctions or a false narrative. Administrators versus people, town versus country. Of course, differences exist, but administrators, civil servants are also people, citizens of their countries, who are concerned about climate change and the future of their children, the future of the planet. High energy prices hurt people who live in cities as well as people living in the countryside. A sustainable transition, therefore, requires sacrifices and ultimately clear choices from each and every one of us. We will need to adapt to a different and hopefully ultimately better way of life. The Tower of Babel symbolizes humanity's boundless ambition, and perhaps the moral of this story also points the way to a solution. We need a new approach, not characterized by arrogance that can only lead to downfall, as in the Genesis story. We should not put ourselves at the center of the universe, but take our role as stewards seriously and weave nature and the environment more firmly into the fabric of our lives. We should work together with all our hearts while also doing our best to see each other's viewpoints and speak each other's language, and ultimately we will arrive at a new point in our shared humanity. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Minister, for this, I would say, really inspiring speech. A lot of really, really important point. And of course, you started with Peter Bruegel and you ended with Peter Bruegel and the Tower of Babel and the role humanity plays in nature, putting a strong emphasis on the fact that we need to weave nature into our daily lives. And I think that's of course a big task and a task from which I would say we are very far away, and where I guess many in this town, many in the economic system would certainly think, well, is that going to be possible at all, or do we have to rely and trust our technical abilities and our technical solutions to fix the issues? So I guess my sort of first meta question to you is, to what extent can we rely on, or do you think we should rely on humanity really making technical progress on decarbonization measures, et cetera, rather than on actually pulling back and consuming less? There's a very vivid debate between those that advocate green growth, basically saying green growth is possible because of technological change. We will continue to grow, but technological change will make sure that we can do it without environmental damage. And then there are those that say, well, that's never going to happen. It's never going to be enough. We actually have to sacrifice some of our welfare and our sort of daily consumption. And I wasn't quite sure where you ended up on that debate, because you ended up with the image of Babel, but throughout the text you talk a lot about sort of very concrete policy measures throughout your speech. And so perhaps I just push you on this sort of very fundamental point and where you stand in that debate.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. As a Minister of Finance, I don't always get to ask this question in the Netherlands. But I think we have to go back to basically the report of the Rome Commission, limits to growth. And I can't imagine, but I am not somebody who's technologically schooled. I believe we need to alter the way we consume, we produce, do it in a sustainable manner, and that means choices, and that also requires us to change. I don't think that technology is the panacea to all evils, and if it is not equally and equitably shared and distributed. So from a Eurocentric perspective, perhaps you might think you have a theoretical chance, but the rest of the world is left behind. So what's the story there? And already the divide between the haves and have-nots has been reinforced again due to the corona crisis. It has been reinforced if you look at the impact the Ukraine war has had on many other countries, a re-triggering of famine or an acceleration of poverty in so many other countries. So if we look at it from a global perspective, technology is always an input. to be used, but the fundamental question is that we have exceeded the limits to growth and the absorptive capacity of nature, climate, and the planet. So I believe it also explains why the reactions to some of the choices that are on the table can be so vitriolic, can be aggressive, at least verbally or more, because it's quite fundamental. And these types of transitions are so real and so demanding in the lives of people that politicians actually need to straighten their backs or rediscover their spine and stand tall and sort of chart forward.
Okay, that wonderful. So let me let me zoom. I mean, I like the one rediscover the spines. So let me
For those who've lost it.
yeah, sure. So let me sort of zoom in on two or three more, if I can say so, more specific points that you made in your speech. And I think one is really related to this issue of bringing people along while at the same time actually dealing with the massive consequences of climate change, but also of higher energy prices. Yeah. And I really could see a lot of the climate agenda at the moment. I'm sure is going to be extremely unpopular with citizens because they would probably say, well, wait a minute, we already have this huge energy shock anyway. So why on top of that some climate agenda? Why do you want to remove fossil fuel subsidies, etc., etc.? I mean, and I think in many respects the energy shock that we are now observing, I mean, a 10 times increase in energy prices, is a huge shock, but it's actually quite similar to the eventual end state of where we will be on fossil fuel energy if we are serious about the green transition. So how do we square the circle, bringing people along in this period of a massive energy shock, bringing them and still pushing them on the climate, on the Green Deal, on the climate agenda?
Yeah, I think that's something that we're all trying to grapple with. But I believe that many people understand that let's say, a large majority understands that climate change is something we have to address. I think they also take comfort in the fact that this is accompanied, the change process is accompanied by subsidies, fiscal measures, and of course also increasing choices that the polluter has to pay. So the balancing act. What has set us back, of course, is the price hike in energy prices, and then of course the trigger to broader inflation. And it's understandable that people say, solve my problem now, park potentially your policy choices for a little bit later. Let us get out of the woods first. And that is something we can't afford. So we have to triangulate, which is of course why most national governments are trying to find subsidy measures, purchasing power compensation packages, but which include an element of sometimes a delay of the fossil fuel transition. And that I think is the hard part, but you need to sometimes take a step back in order to move forward. There I'm quite pragmatic. I think we can't be beholden only to the right thing to do if we're losing the majority of our audience. However, we need to explain, we need to enable, and we need to keep on investing in an acceleration of the energy transition. It's no excuse to go back. Because times are difficult, it doesn't mean we abandon our policy choices because we don't have that luxury. It's not an either or. It's not as if you could say, well, let's sort of postpone climate change a little bit, shall we? I mean, it's happening. It's happening day in, day out, and it's happening more ferociously in so many countries further away. And it would be, I think, irresponsible to not act. And it's upon us to try to make it in a way that citizens not only are part of it, that they are convinced, but also understand these are tough times. And that last message is a very difficult one.
Certainly is. So we of course will take questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question, please type them on Slido. The code is BAM Climate, or raise a hand and I can give you the floor. But before we come to the audience, I have one more question to you. To push you on the investment front, because of course one part is the pricing, the other part is let's get the investment done. You mentioned our Bruegel study, in which we identified that on average 25% of the investment is done by the public sector, which means 75 is actually on average done by the private sector. However, you will not be surprised to hear that there are big differences across countries in Europe, and there are very big differences across philosophies on this. I mean, there are those that basically think it's primarily the responsibility of the public sector to do this, because if we put the burden of the investment on the private sector, we're going to have yellow vests or similar phenomena. And then there are those, I guess, in the north, including in the Netherlands, that really want to put the emphasis on the private sector. So I mean, how do we get this circle square? How do we get this circle squared in the ECOFIN, in the Eurogroup, where, of course, you're a member of that distinguished group now, and where, of course, many ministers will just want to have that extra degree of fiscal flexibility to actually do the public investment they have to do.
Two topics. In a way, I think many ministers would like to take the extra fiscal leeway even before the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine and the subsequent economic crisis that we're all living with. I consider this at the moment, we consider it at two levels. One of them is we need to make the right investments regardless. We need to shield the investments because the transition is, we want to accelerate it. We don't want to slow down on it. So far, we have not seen the green and golden rule as a successful method. I mean, other countries have, for instance, proposed defense under the escape. So you could fill it and it cannot be a substitute. I think the importance is that you have a sort of, you make the right investments, you carry out the reforms, even if they are slower, and you build your buffers. And we have been able to wither the corona crisis because we had extensive buffers. We are providing this year so far, the new budget is not yet known, so I can't speak to it. But what we have done so far is also provided public sector support for households, for a broader community to deal with the impact of energy prices. But the issue is perhaps broader now. How do we go forward? How do we deal with price caps? How do we deal with investments on Fit for 55? You could also ask yourself, do we need to do more? And I don't see it as a north-south. I see it as at least as a national responsibility, or an east-west, a national responsibility to be part of the front runners, to show by example, understanding that not everybody can go always in the same pace. If you are a country that is fully energy dependent on the Russian Federation, it's understandable that you talk differently. Your needs are more acute. So from a European Union perspective, from a political relevance and solidarity as well as coherence, we need to continually understand each other, but we also need to regard the affordability now and in future, and what are the right choices. As I mentioned before, domestically as well, in our parliament, every day we are asked as a government, can you do more? Can you do it differently? The focus is on the now, and we need to balance that out somehow. But if you're asking me now that our position has changed on, for instance, the green golden rule, no.
So you remain tough on that one, but if I can say so, now living in Berlin, in Germany, of course, there has been a special debt instrument for the defense buildup, as well as for some climate investments. So in that sense, Germany seems at least at home to be ready to do some deficit spending for those two.
I wouldn't like to go into an unfair comparison, because you have your famous law that we're always reminded of in the ECOFIN, and I think we're on par when it comes to many of the choices. And if you compare GDP, size of population, deficit, etc., then I think we're not doing so badly in the choices we make. We have over 60 billion euros set aside for climate adaptation and nitrogen adaptation alone, and other such funds are in existence. So we're not behind. And defense spending, we're meeting the NATO norm in 24-25, and we didn't have to go into debt for that.
Okay, that's
That's the difference.
that's a great difference. Okay, let's open up for some questions from the audience. So if you here, Eric.
Thanks. I'm Eric Nielsen from UniCredit. Thanks for a very good speech. I liked it very much. I have one question, though. You spoke a lot about how we needed to educate people on the right consumption patterns and all the rest, and us in the financial sector have to do the right thing. I agree completely. What I missed a little bit is the fiscal incentives. A few years ago, the IMF spent the whole fiscal monitor report arguing for a carbon tax, and nothing happened. Right? Today, I wish we had done, or you had done, because then it would have been your revenues instead of Putin's revenue, and we have started to adjust the spending now, and then you could have had an easier time doing what you need to do now, which is ironic, right? You are giving subsidies to keep spending on petrol and stuff, which I understand for social reasons. But isn't it a little bit too much to ask for the financial sector to sit back if some oil company come and say, we'd like to borrow some money to explore because we found this new thing, and we need the oil? Isn't it actually for economic incentive better or more efficient if the fiscal authority start to tax the bad stuff? And then you can make it revenue neutral or whatever to subsidize green stuff or whatever. So I missed a little bit in your speech, if I may say, if there's not a more direct role when we are through this very exceptional thing where you need to take care of the more vulnerable people in society, is there not a more direct role for fiscal policy to give the incentives to get where we need to go?
Yeah, if you were to speak as an economist, of course, the fiscal incentive is always an important tool to change behavior and in a way induce in a very direct manner the choices companies or people will make. However, in politics, the art of compromise, we have not always been able to achieve all that. So this is the package we are speaking from now. In the Netherlands also, a critic of the new government's package of two big new subsidized funds, one to combat climate change and the other one to deal with the nitrogen crisis in country. The big critics said it's too much on the subsidy front and not enough on the fiscal policy. And I think that's a fair observation. However, this was an outcome of a political negotiation, and this was the pathway, because we also said, you know what, this is such a difficult transition for many people and companies, let's make it easier. But you could argue, if you are fiscally stronger in that, it could have had the same result, or faster and sort of better for the taxpayer. However, the reaction certainly, which has already been tough now, out of anxiety, concerns, and lack of clarity perhaps about future prospects of certain sectors, the reaction could have definitely been also worse. So it's a balancing act in political life. But I hear you, rest assured. The other point is, of course, the discussion now on the different papers that are circulating, at least out in the media. We haven't taken a formal position yet. Also, of course, speaks of a different variations between price caps. And I think the discussion in future will certainly be about fiscal incentives or disincentives and changes. When it comes, for instance, to export credits, we have aligned ourselves with the statement that came out of Glasgow to reduce or to go down to zero when it comes to export financing. I have called upon, in a policy note, I have addressed the financial sector in the Netherlands to ask them by the end of this year to determine and to show how they are accelerating towards the green transition, how they are making their investments, and to sort of phase out. If the pace of change is not fast enough, we have promised legislation. That's another nice stick one can have in political life.
Okay, a few more questions. Please raise your hands clearly so that I can sort of also make a list. But I see Maria, Alessio, Jakob. Maria, please.
Thank you very much, Minister. Maria de Mergis from Bruegel. It's interesting how we pivot between short-term problems, which is of course the energy issue, and long-term problems, which is much more the climate. I want to ask a question on the longer term. You use the word buffers. I think that's an important word, and of course that means debt, the ability to be prepared to meet future shocks. There is, I think, it's a fact that by the end of the multiple crises that we've had in the past 15 years, indebtedness in some countries is going to be even prohibitive. And when indebtedness is prohibitive, the first thing that goes is investments in the future. How much do you worry about the fact that, after the multiple crises, there will not be an equal advancement in terms of meeting climate objectives in Europe? I'm not talking about the rest of the world, but in Europe, simply because the buffers are not there to meet even further down the line challenges. And with that, is there perhaps scope for some more coordination, at least in tackling what is truly a public good, namely climate?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a real issue, and it will not only be the risk of a downturn in investments in actions to combat climate change, but even social goods such as education or health or social provisions, social safety nets. That, of course, in the scale of things, is always a reality when governments are struggling. But I think we also need to focus on the reforms that are required. And we also need to be clear-headed that these are very difficult times ahead. And we shouldn't ignore that, I believe, also in our public communication. If you look at the corona crisis, another exogenous shock, I think many people in Europe, we've all come to believe if we provide the short-term assistance across the board, because governments were forced to make choices, we compensate. And I think people understandably have gotten used to being compensated for every setback. And now we're in an era where we need to make difficult choices, both for the long-term good, but also to deal with the short-term impact of the current crisis. And those are almost dichotomous events, and they're sometimes contradictory. But the attitude and expectation of many citizens is that, well, we've done it in Corona time, therefore we can repeat the same exercise. I don't think that's possible, A, because we don't know how long this will last and what the longer term impact will be. A recession may be looming. And we need to change regardless. So if I'm worried about the differences within the European Union when it comes to economic resilience, so to speak, and fiscal resilience, yes, but I think that was the case before the Ukraine crisis. It's been reinforced potentially. It does mean we need to walk and talk more together. Does it mean we need to have new funding mechanisms? Not necessarily, because that's often what's the first ask. What can we do together? Financing debt, etc. And there we are reticent, because we want to also focus on the reforms and the investments. But I understand you can't look at everything in separation. But our attitude will remain reserved.
Reserved, but not precluding the
Well,
instrument.
I spent 30 years in international affairs.
Right.
Reserved can mean many things, but reserved is a polite word of saying we're not convinced.
Right. Okay, that's clear.
She's worked in the Netherlands.
So Alessio Terzi and then Jakob Kierkegaard. And if there's, I think we can take one more. If there's someone in the back, please raise your hand that I can see. But Alessio, please, you have to.
Yes. Hi, Alessio Terzi. I'm an economist at the Commission. I wanted to go back to Guntram's meta point and just ask a clarification. He asked you, let's say, what your position was exactly on the green growth point, and you said you sort of answered by linking it back to the limits to growth report, and then you added in the extra dimension of let's say the divide between rich and poor. So do I understand correctly that what you're saying is we need to shrink the economies of rich countries so that poorer countries can grow, and this is part of the solution to climate mitigation? Or in other terms, is the Minister of Finance of the Netherlands a degrowth proponent? Thank you.
I'm sorry, you read more into what I said, I fear. I didn't say we need to grow less so other countries can grow. The years I worked, for instance, for the United Nations Development Programme, it's quite a while ago, almost 10 years ago, we spoke a lot then of green growth and green jobs, and it continued for quite a while. But I believe in the current analysis, and obviously having reassessed the impact of climate change and the damage done that cannot be made undone anymore, I believe we need to have a conversation of what type of growth, and we need to look at well-being and welfare. And so far, in many European countries, we have insufficiently looked at it. Funnily enough, in developing countries, we've spoken a long time about the SDGs, well-being, welfare, what does it mean, the Human Development Index, and. So I'm not sure if it's an either or. I actually don't know. But I know that our old mantras are being confronted with a harsh reality of the results of our actions as human beings that were perhaps too limited. And we have lost a large part of our planet and our humanity, of whom we also, at the moment, we talk very little of what the war in Ukraine means to so many other countries on the African continent. Do you read many reports on famine in other countries? So it's not whether we grow less so others grow more. Others will not be able to prosper. And they have a setback already in all their gains. The reversal has been so damaging between Corona and this war that we have to worry about how big the divide will be, how we can help assist them again to lift the growing millions additionally out of poverty, look towards stability, and deal with climate change, and also adapt ourselves. It's about adaptation. So I think, as I said, perhaps you read more into my answer. I'm searching.
Right.
I'm a political economist. I'm not an economist.
That's a very good one. Jakob Kierkegaard, please.
Jakob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute in Washington. Question, I just wanted to return to this, your previous answer of this sort of, I wouldn't call it maybe a trade-off between the political needs of, redistributional aspects and the fiscal incentives offered. I certainly acknowledge that right now, obviously, we're in such a situation. But at the same time, if you look at this debate of whether something is a tax or a fee or just a price, right? I mean, we have certainly in the years just preceding the war, and we still have a carbon price of, close 80 to 100 euros per ton, which I think if you had asked people, 5 years ago, they would say that would have been revolutionary, right? So while you acknowledge that you were skeptical that politically you could go further on the explicitly fiscal carbon taxes, etc., do you see a bigger role then for carbon pricing? While basically I am asserting that perhaps at least that the political implications of carbon pricing, even at levels very high, seem to be less.
Well, in general, I mean, to be honest, I want to be a little bit cautious here because we have a number of debates still happening in the Netherlands. So I don't want to pretend here as if I speak on behalf of the government or there's some big policy announcement. We are still deliberating internally within the cabinet, so to be fair. So I can say all kinds of bold things which are then becoming meaningless afterwards. So I think it's important in general that we reassess all the time if the instruments in our toolkit are still the right ones for the situation we're tackling. That just as a way of thinking and acting and methodology. I think many domestic governments and ourselves too have to revisit all the time. Are we still acting in the appropriate manner compared to the crisis we're trying to tackle? So from that regard, I think the entire discussion on pricing, levies and taxes, probably needs to be thoroughly reassessed if it's appropriate compared to the climate goals, Fit for 55, if it's appropriate and helps us deliver, and at the same time actually shields citizens from the impact of the current exorbitant pricing levels. So does it help or not? Or does it make things work? If you were in humanitarian affairs, you would say do no harm. Well, certainly also we are in the business of trying to reduce the harm and do no harm. So I think it's a complex question. But the energy ministers as well are having their emergency meeting on Friday, and we have yet to take a position on some of the questions that will be before them.
Okay, I don't see any further question. Oh, last question, Jürgen Zappari, and then we here in front, and then I think we are actually coming to the end of our session already.
Thank you. How do you assess the role that central banks can play in greening the economy?
Sorry?
How do you assess
Oh,
central banks promoting green economy? Do you have any views on that?
well, I can, of course, they're all independent. The Dutch National Bank is independent. The ECB is independent. We respect their independence. But I think they have they play, certainly in the Netherlands, the Dutch National Bank also plays a very interesting and at times pioneering role in advancing these types of issues, and also pointing to, for instance, the financial risks that the financial sector is running if they do not take into account sustainability issues or do not factor in the risks in their portfolios. So they have I think they have not only a custodian role, but I would almost say a guiding role. And I think that's very important. But I can't assess the roles played by other central banks. I can only speak to the one I observe the most, which is the Dutch National Bank.
All right. Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you so much for joining us today and for your frank answers and your great speech. It was a very inspiring speech. And thank you for all the great questions we got from the audience. Certainly a topic that continues to be on top of Bruegel's agenda, but I think on the agenda of many, many other places as well. So thank you so much.